Now we'll proceed to the part two of the natural state of medical practice, and this has to do with a prehistorical analysis. But what initiated valid ancient medical practices in the first place? Specifically those of Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, India, and Greece. To better assess prehistoric primary civilizations and proto-civilizations, it is first necessary to focus on the formative years of those 5 historical civilizations for which evidence of medical progress, transient as it was, still exists. If common characteristics associated with their initial success can be identified, those same characteristics can then be sought in prehistoric civilizations. Recall that the famous ancient medical writings exist for each of the 5, and I have reviewed all of them in translation, and including related scholarly papers. And in the natural state of medical practice, I present some of their content and my opinions on their scientific merit. So let's start with ancient Greece and the city-state of Miletus. The history of Miletus from its founding until its razing by the Persians in 496 BC is briefly reviewed, with a focus on its early government and commercial enterprise. Miletus, arising de novo in the 11th century BC, is selected as a paradigm population for an attempt at understanding the origin of the medical successes of Hippocratic Greece, because the small island of Kos can be disregarded as the source. Now, Miletus was a primary city-state in that it was not founded by a branch, as a branch of a larger settled society. Reaching a population of about 10,000 and having many colonies by 800 BC, it was prosperous and commercially dominant. Information on its governance, internal politics, commerce, social structure, and its many notable citizens is reviewed in the natural state of medical practice. Selected metrics and observations, including population size and density, physical area of hegemony, governance, monuments, and life expectancy are then summarized. Then the prehistory of Sumer and the founding and rise of its dominant city-state, Uruk, are presented. The early agricultural and commercial prosperity of that city before its conquest by the Akkadians in 2350 BC is proposed as the social milieu in which a network of medical practitioners acquired the ancient wisdom of clinical medicine that would find its way into later Babylonian medical writings. Extant writings and legends suggest that the independent Azu, or physician, was recognized as a commendable member of society probably as early as 3200 BC during the late Uruk period, although mature cuneiform probably was unavailable to record his observations until about 2900 BC. Suggestions of early democratic process exist, and it is concluded that the likely timing of the clinical material found in the Sumerian Treatise on Medical Diagnosis and Prognosis was in the late Uruk period, or the first dynasty, before rigid dynastic control supervened. In Egypt, the original compositions that would be transcribed about 1550 BC and subsequently known as the Ebers and Smith medical papyri can be traced to the proto-dynastic or early dynastic periods of Egyptian history. The proto-dynastic would be 3300 to 3085 BC. In addition to linguistic evidence, reasons for this claim are presented. The principal one being that the status of society prior to unification of Egypt under the pharaohs, which occurred in 3085 BC. A period noted for flourishing commercial manufacture, population growth, and prosperity. As the largest urban area along the Nile prior to unification, the city-state of Hierakonpolis is selected as the most likely site for the acquisition and collation of medical wisdom that is present in the two famous medical papyri. To India, recent archaeology has revealed the remarkable remnants of an Indus River Valley civilization that may parallel in scope the Mesopotamian. In contrast to Uruk, the minimal evidence of fortifications and social stratification provide traditional support for a relatively egalitarian social organization in the region for much of its history. The prospering Indus River Valley civilization, roughly 2600 to 2000 BC, had access to the Arabian Sea, to Central Asia, east through the sub-Himalayan belt across the Indian subcontinent, and to the tropical south. New findings indicate the local culture, rather than any Indo-Aryan immigration, was the likely source of at least a portion of the four Vedas that have guided Indian culture ever since. Now, the principal relevance of medicine to medicine has been the Atharva Veda, which can be found the foundation of Ayurvedic medicine. The Charaka Samhita, now roughly 2,000 years old, is the classic expression of Ayurvedic medicine, and it contains a wealth of clinical material, unfortunately rewritten over the ages to support a theocratic elite class, the Brahmin. But the original objective observations probably derived from the Vedic age, when the Indus River Valley civilization was commercially flourishing, suggesting the presence during that much earlier period of a network of medical practitioners in its prospering early cities. That such medical acumen was a rural acquisition following the decline of that civilization is untenable. And again, looking eastward, legend holds that it was in the time of the Yellow Emperor, about 2500 BC, that the Chinese medical classic, the Huang Ti Ne Ching Su Wen, a dialogue between the Yellow Emperor and his ministers, was composed. Although modern documentation places its composition about 150 BC, at that time its contents were already considered ancient. The traditional location of the Yellow Emperor is northeastern China. An example of the contemporary Longshan culture city-state in that region is Liangchengsen, a prominent coastal commercial center, and one noted by archaeologists, in part from the nature of its ceramics, to be relatively free from centralized authoritarian control. Although no medical presence has so far been uncovered from archaeological sites, it is proposed that the medical observations in the Huang Ti Ne Ching Su Wen were first made in such an urban environment. Over the centuries, substantial new content was amended and emended, but underneath the New Age additions and the heavy editing in the 8th century AD by Wang Bing, a non-physician, the practical and sometimes acute observations made by those ancient practitioners can be detected. These, the true authors of the authentic portions of the Huang Ti Ne Ching Su Wen, will remain unknown, but we can opine about the social world in which they worked. Now, in reviewing the preceding 5 civilizations, we think of the 4. A distinction must be made between the so-called great civilizations and primary civilizations. The great ones are sequential regional civilizations. But their geographic continuity and longevity, when achieved or maintained by conquest, is popularly viewed as a manifestation of greatness, but that's an epithet clearly unearned. A primary civilization, on the other hand, arises de novo, is independent of a pre-existing civilization, has the freedom to lay the groundwork for cooperation, specialization, and subsequent prosperity before authoritarian centralization occurs. Thus, each of the four great civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and India began as a primary city-state. Those four city-states and Miletus are compared with regard to size of the local population, the regional population, population density, and other things. The term heterarchy is introduced, and a definition of heterarchy is a multifocal system of management in a social system in which there is no permanent head. And then this is followed by a discussion of cities and urbanization in general. So that takes care of Miletus and the four great civilizations. Then, after defining a lesser civilization, there is an explanation for the selection of 12 primary prehistoric civilizations and proto-civilizations for analysis, including a discussion of the significance of alluvial environments, geography, reasons for non-selection, and issues relating to identifying form of governance. The civilizations were all primary, all 12, and their flourishing years are presented. I just mentioned a couple here. The Norte Chico civilization in South America flourished 2600 to 2000 BC. The Cahokia civilization, civilization centered around Cahokia in the Midwestern part of the United States, which flourished around 900 to 1300 AD. The Çatalhöyük civilization in central Turkey, which flourished 7000 to 5800 BC. And Geni in West Africa, that flourished 450 to 1050 AD. All a précis of each of the 12 lesser civilizations is given, along with a list of the same metrics and other characteristics that were applied to the first five, the other five historical civilizations. And this is followed by a summary of those characteristics relevant to present purposes. With those data now in hand, and getting closer to the end of this presentation, limited and circumstantial as the data are, discussion focuses on lifestyle decisions and urbanization. Following the late Neolithic, it took several thousands of years before personal preferences led to agricultural settlements and village life. That decision was clearly not an easy one. Focal commercialization then led to urbanization. But with one possible exception, a most remarkable finding is that in none of the 12 prehistoric civilizations, or proto-civilizations, was there evidence of formal medical care or medical care of any kind. This was so despite the long duration and the large size of some of their well-defined population centers. Çatalhöyük in the 7th millennium BC in central Turkey, population 8,000 to 10,000, lasted over 1,000 years. Geni in sub-Saharan Africa in the 1st millennium AD had a population as high as 50,000 and flourished for 600 years. And the Kukateni Tripilia civilization in Eastern Europe that had centers of population of 10 to 30,000 and lasted over 1,000 years no evidence of any medical establishment or medical care. Now, this must be compared to the mere 2 or 3 centuries over which ancient Greece and the modern West moved from simple empiricism to scientific understanding. And then I discussed the Australian Aborigines, who, with their strong kinship systems, have, for at least 50,000 years, failed to develop either medical practitioners or a single town. Now, a separate issue is life expectancy, and of those 17 civilizations mentioned in this monologue, for which there are data, the average life expectancy is little more than 35 years for the common man and woman, and children usually did not know their grandparents. A sad commentary on social organizations of the human species, but a spectacular comment on the freedom of Western nations where life expectancy now approximates 80 years and grandparents are not rare. That the life expectancy of the common man and woman has surpassed that of the orangutan and gorilla only in the past 200 years is reviewed and can be considered the consequence of adhering to natural law in the West. More on this later. And so, a crude statistical assessment of the data from the 17 civilizations in Part 2 received a more extensive analysis in the unabridged publication of this work. But here are its 2 most significant conclusions. 1, statistically, the most likely explanation for the failure to initiate progress in the 12 ancient primary civilizations was the egalitarian kinship system. The second main conclusion is a tentative list of demographic requirements necessary for initiation of a nascent medical profession in a primary civilization. And I list 4. 1 is a collegial network of at least several medical practitioners. It don't need many, a handful. 2 or 3 centuries of social stability, which is what Greece had and what we have had. Prosperity, as evidenced by trade and specialization, and prosperity sufficient to support medical practitioners working for profit. And 4, a localized population in the tens of thousands, but perhaps as low as about 10,000. But for this overview, social factors will now receive our attention. Egalitarianism is closely examined because its effects are greatest in that segment of ancient populations from which medical practitioners arose, the plebeian or commoner class. Definitions of egalitarianism are discussed, with social egalitarianism as a practical answer to social organization in early and primitive societies. With permanent settlements, archaeological characteristics help scholars identify egalitarian communities. As for the mechanism by which egalitarian social organization was usually selected, Maslow's system of motivational hierarchy is discussed. The primal levels of the hierarchy, survival and safety, are pressing personal motivations and are considered irrelevant to egalitarianism. But now the need to belong motivation comes into play, as each member attempts to adapt to or modify the behavior of others to accommodate his or her own behavioral preferences. At some point, the more forcefully impelled or popularly held opinion restricts opposing ones. Thus, a seemingly democratic result in an egalitarian society that has determined its social organization can shut down all alternatives. Primacy of the band or tribe over the individual also demands redistribution, another inhibitor of progress. But it is concluded that the evil aspects of egalitarianism decrease as trade promotes urbanization, prosperity, and population growth. It does this because urbanization, being solely a consequence of commercial ventures, weakens kinship allegiances and provides a window of opportunity for individuals and families to break free from the tribe. To break free from the kinship means that individuals can now respond to their own needs rather than those of their leader or their society. It also provides a more discernible opportunity for realization of natural law, following a definition of natural law that includes its applicability to all mankind. It is axiomatic that it must apply equally to both early and modern man, including ancient hunter-gatherers. As far as it is a law, it exists to assist social man, and to do this, it protects the individual from other individuals. Because of the varying definitions of natural law, the concept as used here is equated with the moral sense, as described by Dr. James Q. Wilson. It is our conscience. I then discuss the ethical laws of Thomas Aquinas, the ethical laws of the Ten Commandments, and the Golden Rule. These I concisely equate with the inviolability of human liberty. In short, no one wants to be killed, hurt, robbed of his or her possessions, or purposely misled. Thus, it is wrong to do this to others, and we know it. Evidence supporting the existence and general applicability of natural law in historical and modern societies is reviewed. Its relevance to earlier human societies and consequences of the consequences of actions in accordance with or inconsistent with natural law as they affect the development of primitive society are then discussed. The conclusion is that social egalitarianism and egalitarian kinships include within their strategies infringements on individual freedom inconsistent with natural law and are therefore immoral. It is argued that for millennia they have inhibited proper societal evolution and the realization of progress. Natural law functions to protect the undirected effort of individuals so as to assist communal good, but it is easily displaced by passion, rhetorical persuasion, and threats. Sadly, as a consequence, the felonies of a few have over thousands of years devolved great misery upon the many. Briefly mention the role of writing in promoting progress. It is concluded that inscribed symbols first develop as a tool for commercial operation. But proper writing is a sign of progress, not a cause of progress. In this sense, it can be equated with a medical practice as an early marker of progress. Once matured, the usefulness of the tool is remarkable to the point that it becomes unexpectedly an intellectual end in itself, and it abets progress. This is a nice example of spontaneous order and unintended good. It is therefore the formation of small autonomous groups promoting self-interest that, although developing in parallel with writing, are the true initiators of progress. The optimal small autonomous group is the koinon, and its features are discussed in detail in the natural state of medical practice. It is proposed that independent self-interest groups are more likely in a hierarchical society than a monarchical society, because such a society permits individuals to forego previous allegiances and thereby be free to pursue specialized self-interests that evolve as part of the previously mentioned settlement hierarchy. And so, concluding part two, after a definition of historicism and a review of its criticisms, it is argued that historicism, which some argue allows us to predict future events based on historical experience, may justifiably identify some basic threats to human progress, and as an aspect of social science should not be discarded. It is further argued that historicism has yet to be fairly tested, for history has never recorded a satisfactory civilization. Duration is surely not a guide. The negative social consequences of political authoritarianism on the maturation of progress, as discussed in part one of this summary, and of social egalitarianism on the initiation of progress, as shown in part two, have been identified in this work. The importance of smaller groups to progress is discussed, and the profound distinction between democracy and liberty of the individual is noted. Progress, which emerged from release of the plebeian class, was not the consequence of democracy. It was the consequence of recognition of rights of the individual that permitted the voluntary autonomous group of plebeians, fed and led by self-interest, to discover and invent. That type of group, labeled herein as the koinon, finds its place at the pinnacle of the proposed new theory, the isogorial theory of human progress. Democracy is nevertheless useful, for it is the only form of governments that can accommodate the existence of koinons, meaning that it is the only form of governments that up to a point can resist the temptation to preclude or otherwise interfere with self-interest group activity. And it is the not so subtle threat of today's centralization of political power that such support can be withdrawn on a massive scale